The elliptical geometry of the Carolina Bays and their consistent southeast orientation was first discovered after the invention of the airplane made it possible to get aerial photographs of the Earth's surface in the 1930s. Many ideas have been proposed for the formation of the Carolina Bays, including meteorite impacts, beaver ponds, fish nests, and the action of the wind on pools of water. Many unfounded ideas about the formation of the Carolina Bays persist even today when our knowledge has been enhanced by the broader perspective provided by similar basins found in Nebraska. This presentation discusses some of the most egregious ideas and identifies their flaws. Myth. The Carolina Bays originated as beaver ponds. An article in a website by Bob Cobris from 1992 proposed that Ice Age beavers could have created vast expanses of ponds and wetlands that exploded into steam when a comet arrived. The radiant energy from the incoming bolide produced violent steam explosions in the beaver ponds and other wet spots, and the pressure pulse from the blasts gave the bays their unusual regular shape. The giant beavers became extinct along with the other megafauna at the onset of the Younger Dryas cooling event. 25 pairs of North American beavers were introduced to Tierra del Fuego Island in 1946 with the aim of developing a fur industry. The forests of Tierra del Fuego were not adapted to the impact of beavers. When beavers cut a tree, it died because it did not regenerate branches from the roots like the trees in North America. This image shows a series of beaver ponds along a stream. One of the problems with the beaver hypothesis is that beavers build their ponds along the streams, whereas Carolina Bays completely cover the landscape, even in places where there are no streams. This is definitely a myth. The glacier ice impact hypothesis, published in 2017, proposes that an extraterrestrial impact on the Laurentide ice sheet ejected ice boulders in ballistic trajectories, and that the secondary impacts by the ice boulders created inclined conical cavities that produce shallow elliptical bays by viscous relaxation. The glacier ice impact hypothesis only proposes a sequence of 4 mechanisms responsible for the origin of the Carolina Bays. However, the Younger Dryas impact hypothesis, published by Richard Firestone and 25 co-authors, has a broader scope. It tries to explain the Younger Dryas cooling event, megafaunal extinctions, widespread fires, and impact microspherules as the result of an extraterrestrial impact 12,900 years ago. A multitude of papers have been published against the Younger Dryas impact hypothesis. These papers basically deny that an extraterrestrial impact happened 12,900 years ago, and the critics keep emphasizing that no impact crater and no shocked materials have ever been found for the purported event. These papers call the Carolina Bays kettle ponds and dismiss them as structures formed by wind and water without even mentioning their elliptical morphology or their orientation toward the Great Lakes. The Nebraska basins are not mentioned at all. The implication of these publications is quite clear. If there was no extraterrestrial impact, no ice boulders could have been ejected to form the Carolina Bays. Myth. An extraterrestrial impact on an ice sheet just melts the ice and forms a lake. In 2021, a paper by Elizabeth Silver and 5 co-authors described a numerical model to calculate the effect of an extraterrestrial impact on a glacier ice sheet as a possible mechanism for the formation of the Hiawatha impact crater in Greenland. At the time that the paper was published, the Hiawatha crater was thought to be related to the Younger Dryas cooling event, but later studies found that the Hiawatha impact occurred 58 million years ago, which was too early to be associated with the Younger Dryas. The numerical model is completely wrong about the properties of an ice sheet. In the model, ice stretches like taffy and changes its volume like a gas. An image from this paper shows the ice expanding to about twice its volume under the stress of the impact. The defective numerical model leads the authors to conclude that the impact of an iron asteroid would have melted 106 to 164 cubic kilometers of ice, comparable to the amount of water in Lake Tahoe, and that an additional 4 cubic kilometers of ice would completely vaporize. The gross inadequacy of the numerical model can be demonstrated by looking at the high-speed impact experiments conducted by Professor Peter Schultz from Brown University using NASA's hypervelocity gun. The experimental impact sends a shockwave that breaks up the ice sheet, and the pieces of ice are ejected away from the impact zone in ballistic trajectories. The computer model is wrong because it does not produce results that correspond to a real physical event. The ice does not stay in place to melt and form a lake. If an extraterrestrial impact on an ice sheet just melted the ice to form a lake, then no ice would have been ejected to form the Carolina Bays. Fortunately, we have the experiments from Professor Schultz that show us that this is just a myth. But regrettably, the paper was published in a recent peer-reviewed publication, which means that many future scientists will be misguided by the wrong information. Myth. Wind and water created the Carolina Bays. This is known as the Aeolian lacustrian hypothesis. The word Aeolian is derived from Aeolus, the Greek god of the winds, and the term lacustrian is derived from lacus, the Latin word for lake. In 1942, Professor Douglas Johnson wrote a book proposing that the Carolina Bays were formed by wind and water, but the most referenced Aeolian lacustrian hypothesis today originated from a 1977 report by Raymond Kaczorowski in which he compared the Carolina Bays to oriented lakes such as those in Alaska. Kaczorowski conducted an experiment where he carved a circular indentation on a sand tray that he filled with water to represent the model lake and then set a fan to blow over the water. He was probably not getting the results that he wanted, so he changed the fan to blow in opposite directions as indicated by the arrows every 15 minutes for 4 hours. This periodic reversal of wind direction by 180 degrees does not happen in nature, and certainly not in the Atlantic coastal plain where the Carolina Bays are found. Kaczorowski described his experiment as changing the model lake from circular to elliptical, but what he obtained looked more like a bloated American football than an ellipse. Kaczorowski concluded that wind and water mechanisms could have formed the Carolina Bays, and many scientists support his hypothesis in spite of the unrealistic experimental wind conditions and the difference in the resulting shape. In 2012, Moore, Brooks, Ivester, Ferguson, and Feathers made the presentation at the GSA annual meeting in Charlotte, North Carolina, with the title Carolina Bay Formation and Evolution. Kaczorowski was right, with an exclamation point. The author said that historically the Carolina Bays have received attention from those speculating on a catastrophic emplacement through cometary, meteoric, or airburst impacts, and that while these claims persist, the Carolina Bay origin and evolution are much better explained through lacustrian processes of wind on shallow ponded water. The GSA presentation included an invitation for a real-time demonstration of Kaczorowski's 1977 wind table Carolina Bay formation model. Michael Davies attended the GSA meeting and went to that demonstration. Michael wrote, "I witnessed one attempt at recreation where the experiment was set up with a single fan blowing across the center of the pond, and indeed a current was set up crossing the pond and being steered left and right at the other side. I pointed out that wind does not blow as a plume of air, but as a parallel wind field. When a second fan was introduced so as to provide a more parallel field of air, the circulating pattern stopped and the far side simply eroded across the entire half circle, and the far side of the puddle migrated away from the fan as in the clamshell-type oriented bays in Chile. And the experiment never even considered the 180 wind direction shift regimen." These LiDAR images show the rough, irregular borders of the Alaskan lakes compared to the smooth, elliptical shapes of the Carolina Bays. Although Kaczorowski wrote that the Carolina Bays were analogous to the Alaskan oriented lakes, the images make it evident that the Carolina Bays were not created by the same physical mechanisms as the lakes in Alaska. The mathematically precise elliptical geometry of the Carolina Bays can be confirmed by fitting them with ellipses using the least squares method. Since ellipses are conic sections, it is likely that the bays originated as inclined conical cavities or penetration funnels, as can be demonstrated by impact experiments of ice projectiles on a viscous target. Wind and water mechanisms are not able to consistently create mathematically elliptical structures like the Carolina Bays. The idea that wind and water created the bays is a myth that regrettably has many faithful followers today. Myth. The Carolina Bays originated from Thermocarst. Thermokarst lakes are found in regions that have permafrost, which is a thick layer of soil that remains frozen throughout the year and occurs mainly in polar regions. Thermokarst lakes are usually aligned toward lower terrain as water makes its way toward the ocean. The northern parts of Alaska and Siberia have thermokarst lakes, and they are also found in the part of South America that is closest to Antarctica. Thermokarst lakes form when the ice in the permafrost starts to melt. Water has a smaller volume than the corresponding ice mass, and the ground shrinks and forms a cavity where the meltwater accumulates. The book Planetary Surface Processes, published in 2011 by Professor J. Meloche, classifies the Carolina Bays as thermokarst lakes that are often aligned with the prevailing wind. The Carolina Bays are mentioned in the context of active thaw lakes that are found in northern Alaska and northern Russia. These thaw lakes are formed during periods of climatic warming when permafrost melts, causing the land to sag and create ponds that fill with meltwater. The idea that the Carolina Bays originated as thaw lakes from permafrost is also discussed in a book about dunes and sand sheets of the Atlantic coastal plain by USGS geologist Christopher Sweezy. However, Sweezy goes on to suggest that the presence of Carolina Bays in North and South Carolina implies that these states had permafrost at one time, even though two different publications say that the southern limit of continuous permafrost during the last glacial maximum was located in central or northern Virginia. The Carolina Bays can be found in Georgia and as far south as northern Florida. Clearly, there was no permafrost that far south. The map by French and Miller shows some permafrost in northern Virginia during the last glacial maximum, but there was no permafrost along the Atlantic coastal plain in North Carolina or in South Carolina. The permafrost was found only in the Appalachian Mountains in these states, but not where the Carolina Bays are located. We have already established that well-preserved Carolina Bays have elliptical morphology, but Lundin and Trembanis identify additional characteristics in their 2021 paper. Quote, the maximum relief of the thaw lakes, rim apex to bottom of basin, often exceeds 10 meters, much greater than the maximum relief results reported for Carolina Bays. Again, if the Carolina Bays basin deposits are removed, their maximum reliefs are only increased by a few meters, still much less than that of the typical thaw lake. The presence of permafrost, a prerequisite for thermokarst formation, as far south as the coastal plain of Georgia seems unlikely even during prior glacial maximums. It also is not supported by proxies, nor is it supported by modeled predictions of past permafrost extents. End quote. Thermokarst lakes in the Carolina Bays have very different physical characteristics, and there is no evidence of permafrost in the Carolinas even during the last glacial maximum. So in spite of the opinions by respected scientists, we must conclude that the origin of the Carolina Bays from thermokarst is only a myth. Myth. The Carolina Bays migrate over time. The idea that the Carolina Bays migrate is not new. A book by Professor Douglas Johnson, published in 1942, proposes that Carolina Bays were created by artesian springs and that the upcurrent enlargement of the opening caused migration of the artesian spring and transformed circular basins into oval basins. A more recent version of the Carolina Bay migration hypothesis is discussed in a paper published in 2016 by Moore and 5 co-authors titled The Quaternary Evolution of Herndon Bay, a Carolina Bay on the Coastal Plain of North Carolina, USA. Implications for Paleoclimate and Oriented Lake Genesis. The abstract of the paper says that geological investigations of Herndon Bay, a Carolina Bay in the coastal plain of North Carolina, USA, provide evidence for rapid basin scour and migration during marine isotope stage MIS-3 of the late Pleistocene. LiDAR data show a regressive sequence of sand rims that partially backfill the remnant older portions of the bay, with evidence for basin migration more than 600 meters to the northwest. The text of the article says, quote, Carolina Bays evolved over many millennia in the same way that a meandering river migrates through, reworks, and erases evidence of former channels. Evidence of multiple sand rims and bay migration demonstrate this explanation most clearly. Thus, a catastrophic origin is neither supported by geological data nor needed to explain features attributed to the Carolina Bays. The fact that Carolina Bay basins can migrate yet maintain their characteristic shape and orientation demonstrates that Carolina Bays are oriented lakes that evolved over time through lacustrian and Aeolian processes. End quote. The paper says that single-grain optically stimulated luminescence ages place the initial formation of each sand rim from oldest to most recent as about 36.7, 29.6, and 27.2 thousand years ago. The paper explains that, quote, a combined total of 1,079 grains were measured for all three samples, but using a set of criteria for evaluating the signals from each grain, only 224 grains were accepted for analysis, a 20.8% acceptance rate, end quote. Selecting only 20% of the points that meet specific criteria may be considered cherry picking, which is the practice of taking only the most beneficial items from what is available. Although there may be justification for selecting specific data, this process usually biases the results to support the selection criteria. It is not a good scientific practice. The authors provide a detailed image of the migration model based on earlier models of Kacharovsky's 1977 report, showing wind from the northwest, the west, and the prevailing wind from the southwest. This LiDAR image shows Herndon Bay and the sequence of sand rims which, according to the authors, were deposited from 37 to 27,000 years ago. This image shows Herndon Bay and the surrounding area. We have to ask, if Herndon Bay was able to move 600 meters in 10,000 years, is there any evidence that other bays also migrated? There are many adjacent bays with just a single rim and no evidence of migration. This area was subjected to the same wind conditions. If the Carolina bays could migrate, they would all migrate, not just one. The idea that the bays migrate is based on incorrect analysis of the geomorphology. We now have tools to analyze the geomorphology in great detail. We start by selecting points along the perimeter of Herndon Bay and fit an ellipse to these points using the least squares method. The fit is very good and confirms that Herndon Bay is elliptical with a major axis of 1,101 meters and a minor axis of 672 meters. Ellipses are conic sections, so this implies that Herndon Bay originated as an inclined conical cavity. The second rim corresponds to an ellipse that is partially obscured. However, only 5 points are required to fit an ellipse. The second rim corresponds to an ellipse with a major axis of 780 meters and a minor axis of 533 meters, which is a lot smaller than Herndon Bay. This could not be a remnant rim of Herndon Bay migration unless the bay shrank and then expanded again. The third rim corresponds to an ellipse that is slightly smaller than Herndon Bay, but bigger than the ellipse for the intermediate rim. The migration hypothesis becomes less credible because a large bay has to become smaller and then bigger again. It is unlikely that Herndon Bay could have maintained its precise elliptical geometry after migrating 600 meters in the span of 10,000 years. Fitting ellipses to Herndon Bay and the partially overlaid rims gives us the new perspective based on the geological law of superposition. The rims are not evidence of migration, but of overlapping impacts. First, an oblique impact by a glacier ice boulder created a penetration funnel with a major axis of 1,081 meters. Next, a second smaller oblique impact created an inclined conical cavity with a major axis of 780 meters. Finally, a larger ice projectile produced the conical cavity that formed Herndon Bay. This ellipse had a major axis of 1,101 meters. The small bays along the margin of the first one were not mentioned in Moore's paper. Small details should not be ignored. The migration story cannot account for these small bays. These small impact basins were created by small projectiles with very high ballistic trajectories that impacted the ground after the bigger bays had formed. The idea that the Carolina bays migrate is a misinterpretation of overlapping structures. If Carolina bays could migrate, they would all migrate, not just a selected few. This is definitely a myth. There's a saying that you can lead a horse to water, but you can't make him drink. Sometimes I feel that some scientists are like these stubborn horses that ignore the available resources. The LiDAR visualization tool provided by Michael Davies is free and provides very clear images of the Carolina bays and Nebraska basins. The program to fit ellipses to the Carolina bays to confirm their elliptical geometry is an open-source Python program available from GitHub. Anybody can reproduce my impact experiments with equipment costing less than $30. I don't understand why scientists are so hesitant to test the idea that the Carolina bays have a mathematically elliptical geometry and that similar elliptical structures can be obtained by oblique impacts on viscous targets. Perhaps it is fear and not enough thirst for knowledge. It is indeed very frightening to admit that the Carolina bays were created by impacts, because this will lead to the conclusion that there really was an extraterrestrial impact, and then all these myths that make us feel comfortable will disappear and force us to face the reality of a cataclysm. Thank you for joining me in the investigation of the Carolina Bays and the Younger Dryas Cataclysm. There's a link to the LiDAR visualization tool in the description of the video. My book about the Carolina Bays is available at Amazon. Please subscribe to my YouTube channel to be notified of future videos about the Carolina Bays and other scientific topics.